Hi, we continue in Luke 9 today in the second half of the Transfiguration story as Peter responds to his experience of seeing Moses and Elijah standing there with Jesus on the mountain. Before we get to that, just to remind where we're at, if you haven't been watching the videos on Chapter 9, you can see on the right side of the screen that I've been following the intersecting stories of discipleship and Christology in this chapter, which is to say, in green, the question of what it is to follow Jesus, and in purple, the question of who Jesus is. And as we've seen so far throughout the chapter, and we're up to here now, this is like an apprenticeship for the apostles. We saw at the beginning of the chapter that he chose 12 of the wider group of disciples and called them apostles and gave them power and authority. And now he's watching them see how they do at it. And it shouldn't be surprising that they don't get it right the first time. Who does? In fact, they won't get it right till after the resurrection. A point which, interestingly, in the synoptic comparison with Mark, is hinted at in Mark, but Luke takes that out, although we'll see other examples of it later. So let's just jump right into looking where we've been in the synoptic comparison. As we saw last time, much of what is in Luke is not in Mark. So all the bold parts are not in Mark, and all the parts that are underlined here, especially where we're at today, Luke leaves all of this out. So we're up to this point here where Peter responds, and we see Luke adds all of this in this section here. We looked at this part last time, but today we're going to look at this, and Luke adds a number of things there too. So we're going to pay really close attention to what Luke does differently than Mark to shape his version of this. And we also were looking at, in Luke's version, this intersecting relation between, on the one hand, the seeing and the visual in red, and hearing and auditory in the purple. And in the first part, we saw that seeing dominated, the seeing of Moses and Elijah specifically, and there were references to talking and speaking, but we didn't actually hear any words. Now we hear words, and the emphasis is on hearing, and the visual is less, and the emphasis is on the speaking. All the speaking happens in the second part, which you see in the purple there. So seeing primarily here, and hearing primarily here. And also important as we look at this, we'll see it as we look especially at verse 34, are the echoes from the Hebrew Scripture. So we'll be looking at passages from Exodus and from Isaiah and from Deuteronomy to help us understand our passage. One of the dramatic things that's happening here, and you can see it at the beginning of verse 33 and at the beginning of verse 34, and even a little bit in 35, and also in 36, that things are happening simultaneously. We should expect that all this is happening at once, and the narrator is having to separate it out a little bit, but emphasize the overlap. So as they were leaving, Peter speaks, and while he was still speaking, the cloud came, and then the voice came from the cloud, and when the voice is spoken, Jesus was found alone. So this is in sequence here. But the rest of this is happening simultaneously, and notice it's a sequence of the visual and the auditory matching. So as Peter's speaking, a visual element comes, and then as the visual element continues, auditory element comes, and then a visual element at the end. So let's look at our first verse, and then we'll look at our Hebrew Scripture backgrounds. So just as they were leaving, literally, diakorizesthai here, the Greek word means to be separated from. So it's Moses and Elijah that are being separated from Jesus here. Peter said to Jesus, again, Peter speaking for the second time on behalf. Earlier we heard it said Peter and his companions, and now it's just simply Peter speaking. But the first clue that he's not ready here is that he goes to Master. He's already answered the question in the previous scene, who do you say that I am, with Messiah? Which was the right answer, of course, at one level, but Jesus told him not to tell anybody, and then use the title human one instead, which he will use also again. So Peter going back to Master is a suggestion he's really not getting it. But we also recall from last time that he's sort of half asleep. Maybe he's more awake now, but we had been told he was falling asleep, but he had not fallen asleep, so he saw them. So his response is this: it is good for us to be here. What is he saying by that? It's good from God's perspective. He's grateful. It's fun. It's not clear exactly what he means by that. And he doesn't know what he's saying, as the narrator tells us after he speaks, not knowing what he said. Let us make 3 dwellings, literally 3 tents, which would be setting up to make them stay there. We only have tents one other time in Luke, and we'll finish looking at this, but then I wanted to take a moment to reflect on what Luke is trying to say with Peter's response. And he's taking it from Mark. We can put that back up there. That Peter also has the response here, calling him rabbi rather than master, but the identical response here. So a couple of things. One is, we noted the narrator said it was Moses and Elijah. This is the first time one of the characters is noting it. How does Peter know it's Moses and Elijah? They haven't spoken or said names out loud as far as we know. I assume they're not wearing name tags. So that's one thing to consider, and we talked about that a little bit last video. But another thing is, what does this say about their expectation of life after death? We've already seen in this chapter twice, from the mouth of Herod listening to the voice of the crowd, and from the mouth of the disciples telling Jesus what the crowd is saying, that they, in response to the question of who Jesus is, they name three people who are apparently dead. John the Baptist, Elijah, or one of the ancient prophets. And what does that say about their understanding of life after death? We looked at that a little bit when we looked at both the Herod scene and the who do you say that I am scene. But here it comes up again more concretely, because there are Moses and Elijah standing before Peter. And what we don't know is it an apparition? Are they like ghostly figures? Are they embodied figures? Nothing is said to indicate any distinction there. They don't eat or anything like that. This is not like the resurrection stories where Jesus appears and they can touch him and he eats with them. We just don't know what kind of an appearance this is here. If it's not embodied, what is that having Luke suggest to us about what they understand of happens when you die? That there's some kind of ghostly spiritual presence? If they are embodied, does it mean they rose from the dead? Well, Elijah wasn't said to have died. Elijah was said to have been taken up in a whirlwind in a heavenly chariot. Moses is definitely said to have died on the far side of the Jordan River and buried there, never to enter into the promised land. And so one dead person and one raised up to God person, and here they both are. Luke provides nothing to help explain it to us, and so it's just there. But it's interesting in light of, especially in Mark's version that we see here, when they asked what rising from the dead could mean amongst themselves. We don't hear that in Luke, but certainly it's suggested by the presence of these people here, and yet it's not taken up as an issue. The not knowing what he said here is perhaps partly out of he's asleep, or hardly, or almost asleep, partly out of just the excitement about it, and he needs to say something. But at one level, it seems like there's a specific intention, and we hear it in all three of the Gospels about wanting to build a dwelling there, which is to say, to freeze frame the moment. Perhaps you've been on a retreat, or perhaps you've been up a mountain, or some other experience where you've said, this is it. This is the moment. Let's just stay in this moment. But of course, we can't stay in that moment. The very nature of life within space-time for human beings is each moment moves on to the next moment. And so at the same time that we're called to live in the present and not in the past and not in the future, each present moment moves on to the next present moment. And our body has demands on us for sleep and food, etc. And so we can't just freeze frame this moment, or it wouldn't be alive. So they have to experience it, remember it, perhaps compose a story about it, perhaps even paint a picture of it, as the number of paintings we saw last time. But what they can't do is stay there. They can't just keep it locked up. That's just not how this works for human life on Earth. They have to take the experience and continue on the journey. So he doesn't know what he's saying, but it's understandable, given their failure to comprehend and Jesus telling them to be quiet about who he is, that they might think, this is a great moment, let's just stay here. But they can't, and we can't. We have to move on. And to indicate that while he was saying this, the cloud came. And that brings us back to the Exodus passage. There are a number of scenes in Exodus where there's a cloud on the mountain, but the key image is from chapter 24 when they're up on Mount Sinai. So let's listen to these verses from Exodus 24. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of Yahweh settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of Yahweh was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So notice in that Exodus story, everybody down at the base of the mountain can see the glory of Yahweh on the top of the mountain, and Moses hasn't gone up yet. The cloud is there, and he enters at the cloud and then goes up the mountain. Here they've already gone up the mountain, and the cloud comes with them, so to speak. But certainly we're supposed to hear that scene echoed. And later in Exodus, there's another verse, and I won't bring up all of them, where it uses the specific in the Septuagint, the specific word here, episkiazon, for overshadowed, making that connection as well. So while he was saying this cloud came, and notice it's suggesting the cloud has some kind of intentionality here, that it's a thing, not just some vapors in the air, a specific cloud, and certainly it's implying the presence of God, but it never says so, and it never says God is here at all. unlike in the Exodus story where it names Yahweh specifically. It's very typical of the New Testament. We hear in John's Gospel a voice comes from the sky, and some think it's thunder, and Jesus says it's the God he knows as Father, but the text itself never says who the voice was. So that's common in the New Testament. These voices from the sky don't identify themselves as God. We have to infer that. So the cloud came and overshadowed them, much like Gabriel said the Spirit would overshadow Mary and make her pregnant. And so perhaps we hear that Exodus here. They can become pregnant now with the Spirit and be filled with what they need to be able to follow the will of Jesus. But instead, they're terrified. They were terrified as they entered the cloud. Phobio, the normal verb for to be afraid, and you hear English words with phobia in there. Note in my note below, out of the 23 times the word is used in Luke, they're clustered into sections. So we saw this at the very beginning here, and that's, of course, around Mary and the initial annunciations. And then we see it in this section here. This was the healing and Gerasene stories, the healing of the woman and Jairus' daughter and the Gerasene stories there, and now we have it here, and we'll have it again in 10 more verses, 11 more verses, and we'll see it in chapter 12 and in chapter 18. So a number of things terrify them, and this experience of being on the mountain and being overshadowed by a cloud certainly would be something that might terrify people. And they entered the cloud. Notice it's suggesting it's a both-way thing. The cloud came and overshadowed them, and then they entered the cloud. It's suggesting that there's volition on their part. And we notice in Mark, we don't have it. The cloud overshadowed them, but only Luke adds that they entered the cloud here. So it's their specific response is to enter into the cloud. And then from the cloud came the voice. And again, that's echo of the Exodus passage we just saw. And the voice, though, says something different. Unlike in Mark and Matthew, where it says, "This is my son, the beloved," here we hear something very different. "This is my son, the chosen." Listen to him. The chosen only here in the New Testament, as you see in my note below, but it's plainly as an embodiment of Israel as the chosen people. And the key passage is from Isaiah 42, 1-4. So let's listen to that and we can hear what Luke is pointing to. And I want to note as we do that it's a very typical thing, whether of a passage from the prophets or from the Psalms, that to cite the first verse in particular is to imply the whole thing. So the word chosen here implies the beginning of Isaiah 42, but we can fairly listen to this whole passage. "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my life delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching." That passage may well be familiar to you because it's certainly been used not just in the scripture text, but theologically to suggest it was about Jesus. But like with all the prophets are speaking to their own time. Isaiah was not talking in 600 or 800 years, depending upon when you think Isaiah was writing, in advance about something he knew nothing about. He was speaking about a hope in his own time. But Luke, like the other gospel writers, turned to the Hebrew scripture to take those texts and suggest they're being fulfilled in their time. We already saw the text from Isaiah 61 being fulfilled in chapter 4 when Jesus proclaimed it to be fulfilled in the synagogue in Nazareth, and now implicitly the call of my son, my chosen. Notice that just saying my son leaves open son of God or son of man, a human one as we've been calling it, just simply son. And what we hear in that Isaiah passage really is the agenda that Jesus has. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice. And he will not crush those who are barely kept, whose flame is barely kept lit. And he will encourage those, as we see with the care for those in need and on the margins. So that's who this is. The voice is making it absolutely clear. And the command, listen to him. Auto acuite, curiously in Mark it's reversed, acuite auto. And as Miller notes, this aligns the phrase more closely with Deuteronomy 18:15, the last of the passages we'll look at for today. So let's listen to that one now. "Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall listen to such a prophet." And we could have added a few more verses as it continues down in Deuteronomy 18 all the way down to 18:18. We've heard it before both in Luke and in other texts in our Radical Bible series. It's an important passage to highlight that the intention all along was for God to send someone else who would speak like Moses. And so all the Gospels relate to that. And this is where Luke does by using the image of chosen from Isaiah, the devouring cloud from Exodus, and the call to listen to him from Deuteronomy. So that's what's set up, and yet there's no response. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. Did they just disappear? Notice the passive was found, presumably by Peter, John, and James, not by the narrator here. Notice not just seen alone, but found alone. We'll see later, we'll return to the theme of lost and found, especially in chapter 15, where there's a series of 3 parables about lost and found. It's certainly a key theme in Luke, but here, Jesus wasn't lost. It's just that Moses and Elijah have left. So the focus is, as my note below says, the community is called to look to the future in light of the past, but not the past for its own sake. And that's really the key to using the Bible at all times. The Bible doesn't predict the future, and we're not to put ourselves in its world. We can't go into the past, and we can't go into the cultural context that isn't available anymore. But we can look to the past to give us understanding of the time we're in now. And that's how we look at all of history, not just the Bible. Hopefully, if we don't want to just repeat it, as the old saying goes. And so Jesus has not told them to be quiet, as it did in Mark. He ordered them not to tell anyone until after the human one had risen from the dead. And that's a theme we've been looking at in Luke as well, that they won't get it until after the resurrection and the road to Emmaus story. But Mark makes it explicit. It's not explicit in Luke, and yet they kept silent. Perhaps because who would they tell and who would believe it? You'll never know what happened. We were on this mountain, and Jesus suddenly looked like lightning, and we saw, yeah, okay, sure. Right? You imagine even in their world, there's no reason that people would believe that any more than we would today. It's not a matter of that we're more scientific or more rational. It's that people didn't see dead people from the past just floating around on a mountain anymore in those days. They did in our days. So they kept silent, and at least in those days, told no one, because later they will tell. And of course, the implication is that they hadn't told, we wouldn't have the gospel at all. The word for told here stands in the contrast of the disciples of John the Baptist here, where they're told by Jesus, tell John what you've seen and heard. So they're told by Jesus to tell, and here they tell nobody. And also the swineherds and the woman healed were also told to tell. They are, in contrast, like Mary, who treasures the things in their heart, although we're not told they're treasuring them. So they told no one of the things they had seen. And notice that at the very end, we see this juxtaposition of seen and heard and told. So they kept silent. They didn't engage in an auditory act about what they'd seen. Why does Luke leave out this entire section about Elijah? I can't get into Luke's head and know. And certainly we see that Matthew has it here. It has to do with the question of if they now seem to believe, then the question is, from Malachi, as we already saw, Elijah will come before the great and terrible day of the Lord associated with the Messiah. And what Jesus is explaining basically is Elijah has come in the form of John the Baptist. But Luke leaves that whole part out. He just doesn't have the need to have that part. And all we can do is say that he's either already talked about it or he's going to put emphasis on other things. So that completes the Transfiguration story. One other thing I didn't look at here. Moses in Luke. And I made this so we can see how the role of Moses has several parts. So I'm glad I didn't stop this before I did this. I've color-coded these by 3 categories where there's something about the law, the Torah, and Moses is the authority for it. So the story from Exodus, and here the reference of Moses writing and Moses commanding. The blue ones are where Moses is associated with Elijah, perhaps as a symbol of all scriptures we see here in our passage. And the green ones with Moses and the prophets, where it's explicitly the prophets, where it's referring to all the witnesses who God has sent throughout. And so we'll see that after this, Moses will play another part again in splitting people between those who follow and those who don't. And emphasizing a point that I really want to underscore is that Jesus is not replacing Moses. He's fulfilling it. He's adding to this, but it's not Jesus instead of Moses. If they had listened to Moses and the prophets, then they would listen to me. But they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets, and so they won't listen. And that's going to be one of our key themes. So it's very important as we do that we're listening to the Hebrew Scriptures so we can know that what Jesus is about is fulfilling the Hebrew Scripture, not displacing and starting a new religion called Christianity. So next time we'll continue as they come down the mountain, and a man with a child with a convulsive spirit begs Jesus for help because the disciples on the ground couldn't do it. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.